And that takes 30 seconds. Drum roll. 120. Okay. All right, looks like we're live. Hello, everybody. Hi. As usual, it would be great to see a couple of people posting to see that you can see this, um, and so that I know that there isn't a technical problem. Um, all right. So, um, yeah, today I want to talk about why everything's going crazy, and a little bit about getting the some of the lived experience of being able to see it for yourself, see it in how the structure of culture works and how it works inside your own psyche. Ah, great. It's good to see you can see that, Daniel. Okay. Hey, David. Okay. Hey, Rupert. All right. So, um, yeah, so I've actually hit on a lot of the core components. So in some sense, if you've been following each of the posts I've been doing each day this month, some of this is going to be familiar from some of the things I've already mentioned. But I think it's worthwhile to revisit, to sort of refamiliarize, and also to come at it from a slightly different angle. So the the broad strokes of where I want to go, the general picture, is looking at, I make this claim that the reason everything is going crazy is because our culture is built on a foundation of coercion, and coercion shatters psyches. So it's like there's, in some sense, there's two claims to spell out there. I want to explain those and show you to a large extent. I want to show you because once you can see this, and you can see it compassionately, you can see it with understanding, you can recognize not that there's some sort of great curse on us, but that this was actually a necessary part of our own development, then I think that it's a lot easier to see our own processes with compassion and to see what kind of thing needs to happen differently if we want a different outcome. So through this, I'm going to be talking about the same structures I've been referring to over the last couple of weeks that I've been using the term demons for. I keep feeling a little odd about it, though. It's like the metaphor of demons and demonology sort of took over after I mentioned it on August 3rd. I'm going to play with setting it aside for a little while, not because I think that it's wrong or because there's something overly glitchy about it, but something like it's taking over a bit more than I intended. So for this, I'm going to refer to them as memes, which I think is also perfectly accurate. I just want to highlight the reason for there being a terminological difference between them. The term meme often creates, like when people stop confusing it with internet memes, with like the pictures with captions. There's this, there's an impression, hi, Tyler. There's this impression, hey Linda, I'm going to stop looking at that so I can finish what I'm saying. There's an impression like memes are these almost like software programs or computer viruses, or sort of analogous to biological viruses. They sort of go around and they infect mechanically, and you can sort of see people getting affected by them. And I think that's a good metaphor. It grabs a chunk of them. But it misses a really important dimension where if you were to actually watch how they work, they have, some of them develop a kind of extremely crafty intelligence. Now, I say this not to suppose that there is some sort of extra thing that is an intelligence that is coming from outside of the mechanism of how behaviors propagate. What I mean is, if you're going to view behavior patterns as a thing that moves from entity to entity, from person to person, that thing demonstrates intelligence the same way that a biological entity demonstrates intelligence. And when you look at that intelligence and you treat it like a being, if you sort of imagine, you use sort of your mind's social software to pump intuition, you end up with intuitions like it is crafty and it can deceive you and it possesses you and other people. And a lot of the metaphors relating to demons, I think, pull out very nicely. But I find myself having very awkward things like wanting to say, well, I'm trying to create a meta demon of the light. And somehow the metaphor just sort of breaks down. So for today, I'm going to switch over to talking about them as memes, but it's exactly the same thing. There's a demon that wants you to refer to them as demons. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I'm sort of wanting to shake up the structure a little bit because I'm wanting to keep the focus on the understanding, not on the metaphor. Okay. So, so for today I'm going to go over a Just So story. I'm going to say some things about the evolutionary history of human culture. I haven't checked this carefully. Right? And there's an important way in which I don't care that much if what I'm saying is in all of its details correct. The purpose of the story is to make something that is present to people's experience salient. It's to pop something out so that you can see it more readily. Okay. I suspect that in broad strokes this story is correct, but that's not its purpose. It's more like a myth that is meant to make something easier to see. Okay. So bear that in mind. And getting this stuff right, I think, also has some value. So going through some cycles of discussion and getting into the details, I think, can be helpful. But that's not what I'm trying to do right now. So I claim that in terms of the overall arc of evolution, we've gone through 3 major phases as a universe. Okay? The first phase would be physical evolution. This is the process by which something that is the law of evolution, we just don't usually think of it this way, but the law of evolution produced stars and planets and solar systems and galaxies and all of that stuff. That was very slow. And it took about 10 billion years, according to the current story, to get from a chaotic explosion, as I forget his name, but the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy said, in the beginning there was nothing, which exploded. So getting from that point to where there were conditions for life was in the ballpark of 10 billion years. And supposedly the universe has existed for about 14 billion years. Okay, but that's really remarkable, because you're going from utter chaos to the establishment of a planet that is capable of sustaining life. That took twice as long as the time from the dawn of life to where we are now. Right, so in terms of how quickly complexity accelerates, when we did a gear shift to life, something dramatic happened. And that something dramatic was the creation of a pattern of molecules. The current guess is that this was RNA, that would have sort of, like from a God's eye view, intentionally try to replicate itself. But there was no intent at that point. This is just for intuition pumps. Life is molecular, or I'm going to use it this way. Life is molecular patterns that seek to maintain themselves. Or a little more complexly, they're patterns of cycles of molecular organization that seek to replicate themselves. So when you can see it that way, there was another shock point that happened in evolution. And that shock point, I claim, was the creation of language. Okay? Why language? Well, up to that point, behaviors would have been very mechanical, and they still are in a basic way. You look at what kinds of things it takes to train a dog, and you can sort of communicate with the dog, but the dog isn't distinguishing between, the dog doesn't have any understanding of grammar as far as we know. You can't communicate complex concepts to most dogs. But the dogs can still interact with you, and the interaction pattern can sort of shape. Most of that shape has to do with just creating mechanical associations, sort of if-then reactions in the nervous system. Right? So if you want the dog to do something, you want the dog to beg. When you say beg, then you need to sort of shape the behavior. This uses operant conditioning. There's this whole, the whole process of doing dog training is based on operant conditioning, where you give the dog rewards based on varying towards slight improvements in behavior according to what you are intending. See Rupert saying possibly any pre-human animals is linguistic in any meaningful sense. Well, I mean, sure, what about pre-humans? I think that it's possible that language might emerge in some other cases. I think that's an interesting possible discussion, and I think it adds some fascinating complexity. But for now, I want to spell out why I'm talking about this, and then we'll have a better frame for looking at why it matters. And then we can ask that question a little more clearly. So the thing that language does the major advent that language does is that it makes it possible to convey abstract patterns without enacting them. It becomes possible to talk about, hey, Bob, how about you go around that hill and scare the prey to come this way, and then we'll be over here and we'll catch them. It's very hard to convey or construct anything like that without language. But, and this is the key part, this is what I'm wanting to add on to from, like I made a post about evolution created the planets. And if you go back and you look at that, so far what I've said is basically in line with that. But this is the piece that I'm wanting to add for today. When we got language, it wasn't like it was humans like they are today, but they got language and suddenly they could talk and they had all these ideas that now they can share. It's a lot more like the granting of speech to wild animals. Do you imagine what it would be like if you could grant your dog the ability to talk and to understand grammar, to be able to understand English or whatever language? I mean, it's not that if you watch in movies, people have no idea how to convey this without sort of pretending that the dog basically has the psychology of a human. Wittgenstein famously said something like, I don't remember the exact words, and also they were probably in German, but he ended up saying that even if lions could speak English, we still couldn't understand them. The reason is the basic frames that we use, the basic experiential concepts and structures that we use to create a sense of commonality so that when we communicate ideas back and forth, the very foundation of that already assumes a lot of stuff about how our nervous system works and about how our preferences work and how our attention gets guided and what we find interesting for our biological survival and what's irrelevant. And that's different for lions. Right? So there's something very fascinating that happens when you add language that isn't, it's building on something that is unseen, that we have a hard time seeing past, because the act of seeing, the act of understanding, the act of thinking about this is built on language. You can see some hint of this from the instance of feral children. And feral children are the children who end up growing up outside of human culture, raised by wild animals. And like they're feral. And if they get beyond a certain age, as far as we can tell, there's no way for them to learn language. They can learn language roughly the same way that a dog can, roughly the same way that an adult gorilla can. It's not outside of their capacity to communicate, but they're not going to understand philosophy. Not because they're stupid, but because there's something very basic, what John Vervaeke calls a psychotechnology, that is missing in the structure of how their psyche is organized. So there's an interesting question about how did language come to where it is now? Like when our ancient ancestors first got language, they would not have been able to think of philosophy, invent it, and then install it in themselves. That doesn't make sense. That's not how that works. Right? Because the capacity to think about it is built on having already done it. So where did it come from? Evolutionarily, what would the steps have been? What would it have been like on the inside? Like if you could take subjective snapshots of each generation over the course of 1,000 generations of humans, what would it have been like to go from the first instance of recognizing, oh, there's this communication thing that can generalize, to the ability to actually think about your own thinking? Part of the problem with trying to answer that question is when you imagine it, you're already using the evolved psychotechnology. You're already using the evolved ability to think about your thoughts and to imagine your subjectivity that this evolutionary process will have resulted in. Brian says, poetry predated prose. Rupert says, Wittgenstein also talks about someone who had no language prior to age 7, but reports remembering having thoughts about God and the world pre-linguistically. Yeah. I think that there's something very powerful to track about what kinds of experiences are still available to us when this psychotechnology breaks. Music predated poetry. Yeah, that seems believable to me. When this linguistic psychotechnology breaks, like with certain forms of dementia or brain damage, you still like you don't get a total loss of the person, but you get a loss of something that seems pretty important. And it's yeah, there's a whole arc to go down. I don't want to spend forever on that part because I want to move to the modern day and point out what the implications are. I feel like I'm still building up the foundation here. So the key thing from evolution's lens, the reason I point this out as the shock point, the second major shock point in evolution that is comparable to the creation of life, is that at that point when language came about, it became possible for ideas to transmit between people in ways that don't depend on don't depend quite so strongly, depend dramatically less strongly on the details of the history of each of the beings that the idea is going between. Okay? So a structure could emerge, a type of thing that we could now call a concept, an idea, an utterance, a behavior pattern, could now propagate from being to being in a way that was vastly more free of any given individual person. It was sort of like the something close to the original internet, the biological internet. Much like that the internet was like in the 1980s, this was not very relevant at the time. It took a long time for humans to harness this power and use it to our advantage, to be able to come up with clever schemes for tricking other animals and coordinating with each other and inventing concepts like time. This is one of the more quirky things that if you really dig into this and you dig into it in your own psychology, observationally, not philosophically, if you actually look at the structure of how language organizes the way that your thoughts work, one of the things that I expect you'll find is how a lot of your presumptions about the nature of time, the fact that time is linear, the fact that you have a past and you will have a future, this is built on pulling together a whole bunch of different experiences under an umbrella of a basically linguistically mediated metaphor set. And the metaphor set itself is kind of fragmented. There's a little game that we play psychologically to pretend that we're talking about the same thing. The experience of time that we as a culture, or we as human beings would have had before the invention of this psychotechnology is just fascinating to try to imagine, because our minds are not currently well designed. They're not intricate enough to be able to give a high fidelity experience on the inside of that. But anyway, lots of exciting stuff to play with here. But I want to see if I can move towards something, like I want to point out the pragmatic stuff about how this impacts us today. Brandon says, it gave thoughts a life of their own independent. That a key part of what you're saying with the birth of language? Yes, yes. So yeah, the same way that like gravity and the other laws of physics, but like primarily the one that's most obvious is gravity ended up creating planets and creating the conditions needed for life. But that very quickly got overwhelmed once in terms of speed, in terms of the speed of what is relevant, how evolution was operating. Once self-replicating and self-maintaining molecules and molecular structures started appearing, the effects of gravity just became context. It became much less of a defining force of evolution. It just became the framework within which things happen. Something very similar is happening with the evolution of ideas and behavior, the evolution of memes. Once we had language, memes could start evolving in a way that didn't depend nearly as much on the details of biology. This is the big reason why, even though getting from the dawn of life to where we are now took in the ballpark of 4 billion years, and even if you just look at, okay, well, what about like modern human anatomy? That's been roughly in the ballpark of the last 100,000 years or so. Depending on where you want to draw the line, 1 to 200,000 years. Like we've had the hardware we've needed to be able to build the modern civilization that we have for a long time. Like it wasn't that we suddenly stopped being stupid 5,000 years ago, 5 to 10,000 years ago. What happened was at some point, somehow, there was an explosion. comparable to back in biology, the way there was kind of an explosion in the rate of evolution that happened when the ability to combine genes in what we now recognize as sexual reproduction, but it didn't look sexual at the time. It was just sort of an accidental wiggling. But what eventually evolved into sexual reproduction became a new strategy that just exploded the amount of viable variation that evolution could instantiate. The same thing seems to have happened sometime in our history in the last 20-ish thousand years maybe, and it hit a real major takeoff point sometime in the last 10,000 years-ish. That's why, despite the fact of us having modern biological architecture, the biological foundation for a long time, for the ballpark of, let's call it 100,000 years, in the last 10,000 years, it seems like we abruptly invented agriculture and civilization, like cities and empires, civilizations. We created widespread written language, invented language. We went through the whole, or language, sorry, invented religion. We went through the whole axial revolution right after the collapse of the Bronze Age. I'm not relying on everybody knowing all of the details of this, but what I'm trying to highlight is something exploded, right? And we see that explosion continuing. It's still rapidly accelerating. You think about what kind of changes have happened in our modern world in the last 10 years, and what proportion of the changes the last 10 years have had over the last half century. Right? It's kind of freaky. It can't be explained just because of like biological evolution doesn't have a hope of keeping up with something like that. It's still looking around going, what? But mimetic evolution can very, very, very rapidly happen. So that's the large context of where we're going. One way of thinking of this is that language became an abstraction layer, what I sometimes think of as a mimetic operating system for these mimetic programs. But I think that we can actually see what that tipping point was. Like what it was that suddenly caused an explosion in culture. Like what made it viable. And it has enormous ramifications for the way that we experience culture today. So Marcello says, if I walk near a cliff edge, then it's the case that I might die if I walk over the edge, and not if I don't. If I refuse to give the mugger my wallet, I might die, but not if I hand it over. We only call that second one coercion. What exactly is the difference that would make the second one prone to shattering people, or our psyches vulnerable to danger in general? Okay, so this gets us to this business of how coercion fits into this picture, and the business of shattering psyches. So first off, when I talk about, I'm going to do the second part first briefly. Let's see if I can do anything briefly. When I'm talking about a shattered psyche, by default, the psyche is sort of kind of undifferentiated. It sort of starts out sort of shattered. Like there are a bunch of, like you can watch this in terms of how infants experience the world. There's this, in some sense, they don't even know that they have bodies. Like a newborn is sort of looking around going, whoa, right? There's this wildness of how the heck did this, like they can't even articulate it because they don't have articulation. They don't have a frame with which to notice what it is that is amazing them. There's just this fascination of I've never seen before. And there's all this light coming in, but they don't know to think of it that way. It's really entertaining to watch a newborn discover their feet. Right? It's not like when I mention, hey, remember you have feet, and then suddenly you're aware of it. It's more like when they recognize that there is this blob of experience over here that is a coherent blob, and if they poke it and they suck on it, something happens. Like a new sensation appears. It's different from if they grab a different object and they're, right? They don't understand. Like it's just this undifferentiated mass of experience that they're interacting with in order to create a sense of coherence. So when I'm talking about shattering, I think it's an evocative metaphor that I think that conveys a lot of the very reasonable things. But it's more like the putting together process gets interfered with so that the blobs of the psyche that come together and create a sense of, oh, right, there is an Asia, and I am right here, and I have a cell phone, and it's important for me to earn money. These things end up being different pockets of the psyche that have a hard time talking to each other. The hard time talking to each other is what I'm talking about in terms of a shattered psyche. It's not that it started out whole, but rather that the integration process gets kind of interrupted. So a very intuitive way, I think, to see why that would happen is if you imagine that anytime the infant is caught looking at their feet, they get spanked. Right? So they start associating this painful, aversive experience with interacting with what is going on with this blob of newness over here. Right? There's something about the way in which that creates oh, if I look that way, danger. And the body's defense processes, the body's own self-protection mechanisms create a kind of contraction and create some automatic rules that are outside of consciousness for the most part. But they end up structuring what consciousness can do, what consciousness can knit together. And so that's the basic, like, intuitive, visceral sense of, well, how do you, like, how does coercion result in a shattered psyche? Well, it prevents an integration process. It prevents a way for things to knit by directly accessing the fact that the body has a whole bunch of automatic processes to keep it alive and safe, to keep you alive and safe. This turns out to be extremely valuable for a particular kind of mimetic evolution. So here's a problem. If you ever tried to coordinate a time to hang out with friends, right? Just trying to, if you imagine what's involved in saying, hey, Bob, I want to meet you at 5 o'clock so that we can, like, hang out and figure out what to do with the roof repair. Are you up for that? And Bob says, yeah, I'm up for that. If you imagine that Bob just doesn't have any sense of shame or responsibility, like, not necessarily psychopathic, it's just like, oh, I'm just walking around. Sure, I care about things, but also, oh, hey, man, this mango's really tasty. It's just distractible. Like, there's a way in which you're probably never going to be able to coordinate with Bob at 5 p.m. or any other time in any coordinated way to be able to deal with the roof. Like, you sort of have to, like, grab him and say, we're dealing with this now. But I like the mangoes. No, now. Like, there's this way in which there has to be a kind of force to make a coordination happen, even if everybody wants the coordination to happen, even if you and Bob both need the roof to be repaired. There's this whole expression of herding cats. Like, how do you herd cats? Well, you don't. The cats just kind of scatter away from you when you try to do things. So there's this issue with, when you look at how tribes would form to start creating coordination. I'm noticing there's an arc of mimetic evolution that I may have accidentally skipped over that is important here. Let me highlight that there are two kinds of evolutionary strategies that tend to, yeah, people with ADHD, Bob, who has no sense of shame or responsibility, yeah. So there's like two kinds of strategies that memes tend to evolve. This is convergent evolution. This is like general patterns. One type is being useful, right? Like, if I tell you, hey, did you know, like if you run into problems with getting lots of hangnails, then if you just put moisturizer on your hands a little more regularly, this actually helps a lot with the hangnails. Like, I've heard this and I'm transmitting this. This is a meme, which like, hopefully transmits because it's useful. Like, I try it and it works out and I notice, so I stop getting as many hangnails. Oh, that's helpful. So I let somebody else know and they try it and it turns out to be helpful. That's a meme. It's an idea that it has this, it has a transmission pattern of me describing it, Like that's sort of its sexual reproduction stage. It's like the inflammation stage in herpes. um, but it transmits because I found it useful, and I hope you find it useful, and maybe you try it and you discover it's useful, and then you go, wow, and then you transmit it to other people. Right? So that's one way that a meme can be successful. There's a different way a meme can be successful, which is to break its host's inability to transmit it. Okay? I gave an example of this, a bunch of examples of this when I first introduced the term demons. I'm going to continue referring to these as memes, but I think when we're talking, like the things that evoke a sense of demon, it's generally referring to this. I think it most intuitively refers to the second one. So an example is this life cycle of transgenerational trauma, of like the father is an alcoholic whose like son walks up to him and says, "Hey Dad, why is the sky blue?" And the father turns and whacks the kid and says, "Don't ask stupid questions." And the kid learns this kind of terror around, I better not ask questions. I don't know what is going to count as stupid. That ending up dimming the kid's internal experience because he has to shut down his own curiosity in order to survive. This is that coercion element I was talking about before, like this cringe. There's like that gets associated with curiosity and this rapid shutting down. That kid grows up dim, grows up anxious. And I don't mean stupid, I mean like actively shutting down the mental functions of exploration and wonder and wanting to ask questions, among some other things. But this is one of the key aspects of this pattern in this instance. And as the kid grows up, he discovers, like I can keep these terrifying feelings from coming up if I turn to the bottle. Because that was given as an example by their parent. Like they got to see that pattern as working. So they lean towards the bottle to numb their feelings, and then they're in the same state, and then their kid, they end up having a kid at some point, and the kid walks up and says, "Hey Dad, why is the sky blue?" Okay. So that's a life cycle of a meme that installs itself in each generation via pain and coercion, where the target is exactly the faculties that would be needed to disrupt the pattern from transmitting. Okay. So that turns out to be a stunningly successful transmission method. Just in terms of how evolution works, it just turns out to work really, really well for memes. So you end up with a whole bunch of memes having emerged around like both of these strategies, but that second one, what David Deutsch refers to as anti-rational memes. This pattern ends up being so effective at synchronizing and organizing people in a way that is within evolution's reach, that at some point a sort of synergy happened. So an example of this synergy today is with advertising. This is built on top of this already having happened, but I want to point out what this would have looked like as it built up and as what happened very early on. Today, the way that advertising ends up working, like there's a kind of coherence that's between the advertisements. One advertising agency implies that, well, if you're in order to feel better about yourself, you should try our beer. Another one, and it says, yeah, you can. You need a new car, and another one says, well, you'll be. You may have a lot of struggle that you're dealing with, but yeah, you can deal with this struggle for getting clients, let's say, for your business, if you use our advertising agency. And this, like all of these different advertising agencies or ads are not really coordinating with each other in any particular way. But as has been noticed in a bunch of different circumstances, I think I first encountered this in the context of feminist analysis of the way that women are depicted in advertisements. But I'm wanting to highlight a more general point. The thing that is common between all these advertisements is the sense that there is something wrong with you, or some way that you need to deal with the world, that you're not okay if you don't deal with it somehow. and that you need to spend money or get help in order to deal with it. Now, that's not all advertisements, but it's so widespread and it's so distributed that it's not that, oh, I really need to get my teeth clean or I need to go on a vacation. Like there's nothing coherent. These are suggestions about the thing that might address the underlying sense that there's something wrong with you or something inadequate. Now you can try to resist that, that's fine, and I think that some people successfully resist it. But there's something very important about the fact that not only does that distributed effect happen, what in computer science gets called a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack, right? But the effect of that happens to be advantageous for advertising. Most ads don't have to argue you into thinking that there might be something wrong with you or your life or that there's some sense of inadequacy. They can kind of assume it and then build on that to hook you. So that's an example of advertisements being able to build on a previous generation of advertisements that accidentally coordinated in a kind of DDoS attack on the human psyche. It's a little creepy, but there we go. Okay? So now the thing is that all of that is built on a foundation that was already there. It was built on something that was already there. And what I'm talking about is the emergence of that something. If you rewind back, ballpark of 5,000, 10,000 years, it's hard to say exactly when this would have happened. Like what I'm looking at is what the preconditions would have been to get into the agricultural revolution. It looks like, so I'm told, human beings invented agriculture several times. And several times they abandoned it because it's hard. It's annoying. In many ways, it's easier to do hunting and gathering or to do some variation of pastoral work, shepherding. So like sticking in a place and growing plants for your source of food, like, well, why would you want to do that? Well, the part of the reason that turns out to be an advantage, just from a large scale, if you're looking at how human culture would have evolved, one of the reasons it's useful is because you can have fewer people involved in the process of maintaining the health and livelihood of the foundation of existence, with dealing with the basics of food and the basics of shelter, which means you can free a lot more people to do other things, such as become soldiers. So one of the effects that you get is that if a group happens to evolve the concept of create agriculture, have a bunch of kids, and then make those kids become warriors that are coordinated in order to take over more land, to create more agriculture, to create more kids, to create more warriors, this becomes a kind of cultural cancer, in a sense. It has a cancerous effect or a sort of mimetic takeover effect that will overwhelm the capacity of any individual tribe that isn't using a strategy like this to defend against. This wasn't quite the argument given in Ishmael, but the book Ishmael, about the talking gorilla, or the telepathic gorilla, I guess, was making an interesting argument. I don't know if this is true, but I think it's neat. It's kind of cute. That the story of Cain and Abel may have been a form of propaganda pointing at the way in which like agriculture represented by Cain, a particular thread of agricultural takeover, slaughtered a bunch of people who were more focused on things like pastoral work. Abel, who's like sacrificing his lamb, which God preferred for whatever reason. I don't know if that's true, but I think that it's evocative of the type of thing that could very well have happened. But how do you get a tribe to become agricultural and create an army? It looks like one way to do that is to metaphorically attach shock collars to everybody. If you can make it so that the mechanisms that were already there around shame and guilt and fear attached to the sense of disobedience, and you have a sense of, oh, like there's an issue here. Sort of like when you put shock collars around a dog in order to put an invisible fence around the yard. After a while, the dog will just learn you don't go past that fence. You just don't. It becomes literally unthinkable. You can even remove the shock collar and Many dogs, not all of them. I used to live with one that this did not work on at all. But many dogs will learn to just never cross the line, and it becomes unthinkable to do so, even without the shock collar there anymore. You've actually created a barrier in the dog's psyche. Something very similar can happen in a human psyche that shapes it to make certain kinds of thoughts unthinkable. When that happens, it becomes a lot easier for a meme to channel people's behavior. Then it becomes possible for a meme, the meme of agricultural armies, to evolve in a way that can actually direct people. It can metaphorically possess them, move them, take over more territory. And the one that actually does this becomes capable of winning out over the more kinder, innocent structures. I'm not saying that they're better, and I'm not saying that this is bad, but the point is that you don't actually have to envision an extra force anywhere in order to notice, oh, the creation of civilization looks like it may very well have been built on a foundation of installing a sort of a cringe away from disobedience. If you can invent the concept of obedience, and not just as an abstraction, not just as a, hey, we should be obedient. Oh, I think that's a neat idea. But if you can make it directly tied to the visceral nervous system in a way that hijacks the function of consciousness to connect different parts of the psyche, that obedience becomes automatic. It becomes reactive. Like, oh, no, I can't threaten, I can't challenge the chief. Like, I'll just lose my head. And it sounds sensible, because that's what sensible means. Sensible grows up in the context of a culture. So if the culture grows up in a coercive context, because one of these you can't not propagate me kind of memes shapes the culture, then it's going to shape what you think sensible means. Yeah, if my country is under unjust attack, I have to help to fight. Yeah. This is one of the little child memes that comes out of this. And then there's this question of, like, attached to this one, what decides that it's unjust? What gives you the impression that it's unjust? How do you come to that conclusion? Do you come to it because you have a global understanding of how the universe works and how this connects to the way that human culture and the human psyche works, and the way that this evolves into a necessitation at a mathematical level, and in the true sense of math, in the sense of wise knowing, what I call wise knowing? Do you have a deep understanding? Or do you instead have a rehearsed understanding and a set of arguments that you have received that demonstrate why a certain class of people are idiots or dangerous or evil or wrong? I claim that when you actually notice the way that these coercive structures are built into the foundation of how your mind runs by default, when you actually see that and you start to deconstruct it, one of the bizarre things is that the concept of evil vanishes. This becomes very difficult to convey very clearly, because I don't mean there aren't bad things that happen and there aren't people who do them. Like, I'm not claiming, for instance, there was no Holocaust. That's not what I'm saying. Okay? Or that the Holocaust was good. Right? But I am saying that the act of condemnation, there's something extra that is added by the act of condemnation that is itself leaning into these structures being a propagation method for a certain type of meme, and that there's an alternative that honors life and joy and happiness and the ability to fight more. But, unsurprisingly, when we start talking about them in detail, this activates a sort of internal mimetic immune system. It activates a sense of, well, that can't be right. Which is part of why I emphasize wise knowing, and part of why I emphasize I don't want to try to argue anybody into this stuff. I just want to show you. I want you to look in a certain place and see for yourself. And this isn't about me being right. It's about seeing reality. When you see reality and you notice the patterns that I'm trying to gesture towards, turns out that a lot of these memes that propagate based on making you incapable of not propagating them, a huge number of them work by preventing consciousness from being able to notice how they work. If you see them, not just theoretically, but experientially, if you watch it running in real time, you can be free. And the more free you are, the better you are at directing your consciousness, at knitting together the places where coercion has maintained a crack, and perhaps even inserted one. Sometimes you'll find cases where that happens. We most often call that trauma. Right? But you can start to see the structure of that and how it activates in real time at the very foundation of how you organize your consciousness and where you point your awareness. Then something else emerges. That something else feels more true to who you are than the mind is used to thinking of. That whole topic, what that actually feels like on the inside, really needs to be its own video. But I hinted at this before when I talked about a joyful, coherent will. When I talk about the true free will, when you actually feel that and you get it, you see it, and it becomes part of your mental structures, then your mind can start reflecting what feels like your true nature back. This does not require a whole lot of mystical trust. In fact, I think it requires no mystical trust. I think you can just see it. And when it emerges, when it starts to become part of how you function on a day-to-day basis, it emerges more because it turns out truth is a lot stronger than bullshit. It just sometimes doesn't look that way because bullshit is basically, by definition, illusion. And let's see, there's a couple of other things here. Rupert mentions, this is our land, except that we stole it from the Aborigines if we're living in Australia. Yeah. I love the thing that where it's this meme that shows up every now and then. Like I encountered this a whole lot when I was living in Southern California, of people getting irritated about, no, like if people come to our country, they should learn our language. We like all these Spanish people coming over insisting that we accommodate them. No, we should make the official language of the United States English and make anybody who wants to live here learn English because that's what this country is. And I sort of look at them and go, oh, so shall we start learning Lakota? Like, how are we defining which language it is? Are we doing it entirely based on which meme is currently dominant? Then I guess we are determining what language we speak based on mimetic warfare, and now we're just putting it into law? Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Marcello says, for that matter, what gives you the impression that a country is yours? Yes, a meme. Also, the concept of ownership itself is a meme. Like there is possessiveness, like you see this in really little kids, of mine. But the mineness is how they know to express a feeling, which is, I hold this, you can't take it from me. The idea of possession as, I own this and that is an enduring trait of this object, that actually doesn't mean anything intrinsic to anything non-mimetic. This starts to dig into the nature of the self. One of the things that I think that Siddhartha Gautama, the Gautama Buddha, was pointing at when he was referring to the no-self nature of existence that you can come to see for yourself with insight meditation. I think one of the things that he was gesturing towards, just prior to us having any understanding of information theory or computer science or memetics, is that the thing that talks and says I, me, and mine is a mimetic structure based on keeping the mind incoherent. If you look at that structure, we'll ignore the question, it's hard to say this without adding a personness to the language, but if you look at it, if there is lookingness pointed at this, it sort of breaks down the illusion. You start to notice, or rather the mind starts to reflect the fact that there is no coherent self in the psyche that is enduring over time. That doesn't make sense. The closest thing you're going to get is something like the presence of conscious awareness being an organizing principle for the psyche. And when you see that, we'll ignore what you means there, you sort of have to wrap around the language in a weird way, but when you see that and your mind gets that, A lot of people have this kind of experience in psychedelic experiences or in sudden insights of spiritual rapture. There's a sense of, oh, this is simple. It is simple. It's immensely simple. But it's very hard for a mind that hasn't integrated that understanding to understand what that insight is, which is why mysticism sounds crazy and why it goes crazy. Because mysticism is itself a mimetic structure, which in a culture that is based on keeping psyches shattered, propagates better by getting people to expound the views and capture people's attention and give them a sense of hopefulness and interestingness and a way to escape from fear, but only if it's an illusion. It propagates much better that way than it does by saying what's true directly. That's one of the reasons why we keep having mystical insights resulting in widespread religions that torture people to death in the name of a loving God. How does that happen? Well, it happens because the thing that does that spreads a lot better than does truth currently. Linda says, I've heard that early farms used to run away and become hunter-gatherers again, i.e. early farming where slavery based on more literally force of violence. I'm watching a few minutes behind in the video. Yeah, okay, cool. Yep. True. I mean true in that I've heard that too. I think you're responding to the fact that I said that. Okay, so how this brings us to our current predicament, what's going on with the world. This particular structure for organizing human culture, based on basically coercion, it's based on threat, it's based on creating a sense of self. It's an illusory sense of self that gets evolved because it's a mimetically useful structure. It's one of the results of the DDoS attack. If all of these different things come in conveying to you that you need, or conveying to this nervous system that there is a need to talk about you, and you having a worth. Are you a good person or a bad person? Are you virtuous? Or are you one of those evil, wicked beings, like those guys over there whom we should destroy? It turns out that it was within evolution's grasp, within mimetic evolution's grasp, to instantiate a sense of self that the human mind can think about. This creates a concept of you based on pain and fear. Based around a sense of there is something wrong with me, that there's a me that can be evaluated, and now I need to do something to address the threat that I might be destroyed because I am secretly bad. There are variations on this. I think some people have a sense that they have a me that is good, but they need to protect the goodness from encroaching forces. But much more often, there's a core sense of pain that creates a layer of, but I'm a good person and I believe that. But if you see through it, one of the things that becomes really obvious when you actually see through this entire structure for yourself, when you wisely know what I'm talking about, the ability to evaluate yourself vanishes. It doesn't make any sense. It means literally nothing. And that is so freeing. And basically, every meme that guides culture today, writ large, wants to keep you from having that freedom. Which is one of the reasons why all of the paths of freedom that get described have ended up getting corrupted. Like I said, there's something intelligent about some mimetic structures, and it's important to be able to see that. Because if you don't recognize it, you don't recognize the ways in which they use your own capacity to think to deceive you. Whoever you are. See, Marcella says, verified. This sort of thing also happened to early British colonists who came to America. Oh, I see. Farming in an unfamiliar environment was hard, and some of the colonists ran off and joined the natives, despite religious guilt trips to the contrary. Yeah. Yep, yep, yep. That's not too surprising. Okay, so let's see. Brandon says, do you believe it is possible to create something that can propagate on its own that undoes some of the negative effects you're talking about? Or is it something that requires conscious intention and direction, like how you're trying to guide people right now? Do you think that the self-replication of the memes is inherently bad, or just the particular method that has become prominent? I think, in short, it's the method. What I am trying to do, the essential difference between these two, I think, like the functional difference is that, and I don't, this is not definitional, this is something that emerges. It's a convergent evolutionary tendency. The kind of mimetic structure that grabs you and yanks you around by coercion, the kind of thing that makes it so that the police work based on threat. Like if you speed and they pull you over to give you a ticket, that's how they enforce the speed limit. There's lots, like it's a threat-based culture. If you violate the laws too much, they shove you in jail. Why? Because you're bad. Oh, it's corrective, except that we don't care whether prisons are corrective. We talk about putting criminals away like they're bad people. Like that entire coercive structure, punishing children for not getting good grades. What are grades? They're evaluations of the kids. The fact that culture is built on this foundation is coming from this attempt to keep consciousness from integrating the psyche, because if it were to do so, it would kill most of the negative generating memes, most of the memes that create pain. Bringing in sunlight to kill vampires. Right? That it's possible to have different kinds of memes. This is basically what happened with science. The birth of science was the concept of, hey, let's put an evolutionary pressure on mimetic evolution that biases towards understanding and verification. That's the seed of science. It's not the scientific method. The scientific method is a meme which calcified and has now become one rote process that people memorize that, frankly, most scientists don't use. Most scientists don't think, now, what is the scientific method? What step am I in the scientific method? What's the next step? Bullshit. Bullshit. That's not how science works. Science works by, that's funny. Right? There is an art to it. I'm not dismissing the artistry of it. But it's not the essence of science. Okay? The essence of science is sincere curiosity and devotion to the truth. Right? So memes that encourage the integration of consciousness and understanding, those end up being fundamentally antithetical to the evolutionary contexts that support what David Deutsch calls anti-rational memes. So what I am currently trying to do is create a meme that is about memes and encourages consciousness to be fundamentally central to every step of the way. This is a fantastic, in theory, this is a fantastically powerful antidote to the entire structure, because these memes, these anti-rational memes, these things that I think could fairly be called sinister demons, they convey some value, but sort of accidentally, only if it's of advantage to them to continue surviving. They can't coordinate. This is the core reason why our world is insane. When two of these memes encounter each other, if they at all compete for their own propagation, they have to fight. There is no way for them to coordinate and decide, oh, you know what, let's strategize in these ways so that we can work together. There is a fundamental problem where there is no centralized intelligence for these mind-shattering structures that allows them to do things sanely. They can't. So the thing that I'm trying to create, or rather I'm trying to point out really, you already have this seed. It's what lets you watch this video. It's what lets you recognize that you're looking out from behind your eyes. It's the thing that lets you know when you have seen something true, when you know you're lying to yourself and you have something in you that goes, wait a second, where is that coming from? It's already there. All I'm doing is giving it arms and legs. And I'm not even giving it, I'm pointing out how you can grow them. Because the key to this is you can see every step of the way. So if that meme can develop and strengthen, it becomes a centralized intelligence, which is you. And that intelligence can coordinate to deal with all of this world's chaos in a way that the world's chaos cannot coordinate. It can never coordinate. There's no core intelligence. So that's that. All right, let's see. Does moral reasoning have a place in the new framing that you are pointing to? I think so, but I think it means something dramatically different. Shame and responsibility are out the window. And this is extremely alien to our modern ways of thinking. We're used to thinking of morality as being a matter of what you should do versus what you shouldn't do, because that's extremely convenient for creating a sense that there is a value for you to address about who you are and are you a good person. There is instead, like I want to get into this, like what the actual subjective experience is. I'm realizing that I think I had originally planned to weave some of this into this, but I'm already an hour in, so I think I'll have to make another video on this and do another live on the subjective experience of what it's actually like to dive into this. But there's this experience that a lot of mystical experiences will grant people, of this sense of realizing that they are everything, or they are the universe, or they are God, or something like that happens. Our language for it is broken because language is mostly governed by these mimetic structures that shape culture. And their point is not clarity, their point is their own propagation. So there is something about, you could call it moral to notice something like, well, I really shouldn't cut my fingers off. But it's not because there's a should there, it's because it affects something about your experience of the world and your ability to do the things that you want to do in it. In the same way, it turns out that, the game theory works out very nicely here, the reasoning about how people interact and what that means in terms of mutual benefit and competition. It turns out that coordinating with other people in a way that is mutually beneficial and that uplifts others and uplifts you. It's not like you giving away your own well-being in order to help others, right? But an actual, like, let's work together on this. Oh, you're not willing to? Oh, well, how do I orient to fulfilling your needs given that you don't agree to this frame? Like, there's complexity to this. There's a lot of complexity, but the core of it is very simple. If you nurture all beings, then it's like the opposite of cutting off your fingers. You become more capable of reaching into the world and creating what you want. There's sort of a natural structure to that rederives a lot of the things that we consider moral. Like, it's generally a bad idea to kill people. You probably shouldn't torture people. But it starts to challenge a bunch of other things that we consider core to morality. A lot of things. This becomes extremely loud with questions like, what do you do about people who like to torture people for fun, who get a kick out of other people's pain? A lot of our instincts currently is to condemn them. It turns out that that doesn't work. It doesn't work on a global scale. So there's some things about morality which become very practical that emerge from this. There are questions that start to bubble up that result in a kind of morality that in some cases might be considered evil by modern standards. But it's also worth bearing in mind that you go back far enough and the idea of freeing slaves meant you were stupid. Right? So, yeah, so I think that there would still be something analogous to morality, but I also think that it's not going to look much like what we currently think of as morality, because the current function of morality, regardless of the content of what is said, is to control behavior, and in particular control what is and is not thinkable, what is and is not expressible for the sake of mimetic evolution. That's one of the reasons why I'm wanting to move towards eventually being able to have conversations behind some kind of paywall. Because, like, the paywall doesn't prevent these memes from finding out what's going on, but it does by default slow it down a little bit. And that turns out to be really valuable for being able to let pro-truth, anti-bullshit memes really grow and develop, I think. Current best guess. Daniel asks, what is a non-self-evaluative way to track and update trends in one's actions such that they are better for the world? Bright desire plus thinking multiple moves ahead? Kind of. So I think that the thing that I've referred to as bright desire, if anybody watching this who doesn't know what that's in reference to, if you go to my video, A Joyful Coherent Will, I introduce this concept of bright desire. It seems worthwhile to return to that a few times. This is something that a lot of people miss. But it's essentially, what do you truly want? Not as an intellectual thing, but as something you can focus on and move towards. If you do that, your psyche becomes more coherent. It starts to naturally knit your mind together under the banner of your conscious presence. So I think that if you do that with an eye towards understanding systems wisely, and this goes back to a post I made a couple of days ago about what wise knowing is. I'm going to keep coming back to it over and over again because it's an alien concept in our culture, because our culture evolved to destroy conscious access to wise knowing, because wise knowing is antithetical to the evolutionary context of the type of memes that inhibit your inability to propagate them, or make it necessary for you to propagate them. Right? So cultivating wise knowing, not certainty, not emotional confidence, but knowing how things work and knowing where you don't know. The more of that you see about how the world works, about how other people work, about how you work, about how the entire system is intertwined, which can be assisted by a lot of study and examination, but the core thing is just looking. Looking and being willing not to know ahead of time. Wondering. Being willing to look where it is forbidden to look. Being willing to ask questions that are forbidden to ask. And noticing what effect that has on you. So I think knitting those two together, developing a coherent worldview and developing a coherent will in tandem, I think is a huge chunk of developing this. Right? And there's also, like I remember I gave these 4 points of, like, here's my battle plan. Here's my battle plan against like mind-shattering memes. I said mind-shattering demonic hordes. Same thing. Wisely know why these 4 steps make sense. That includes getting a systems level view of what's going on at all scales, but wisely. Second, this bit about I forget what order I put these in, but let's just say second has to do with being capable of being with any internally generated body sensation. We often talk about these as feelings, but often we confuse feelings and thoughts, and we don't notice that feelings are based on body sensations. Okay? One of the most fundamental tactics of the mind-shattering memes is to present you with an internally generated body sensation along with this internal insistence that you agreed to that you can't stand the sensation. Never mind the fact that you're standing it right when it's happening, because there it is. Right? So getting it integrated into your psyche that there is no such thing as an internally generated sensation that you can't stand. Not as a concept, but as a direct, immediate experience. Okay? This makes you unshakable. The third is developing a bright, coherent will. That's the bit about bright desire. There's more to say about this, and particularly about what the internal experience is like. True free will. Not asserting something philosophical, asserting something experiential, because this knits the psyche together. Right? And the fourth, what was the fourth? The fourth was, aiming towards universal same-sidedness. I haven't talked much about this one, but this is antithetical to how demons fight. It's antithetical to the evolutionary context that makes it so that it's possible for an us versus them. You can still fight for things, but what fighting means when you're universally same-sided is dramatically different. I think, and this is open to debate, this is like my current draft, which I'm inviting you to explore and then see, or am I missing something? Not as an idea, but can you see it for yourself? I think this is a reasonable draft of a process of actually being able to, like a non-self-evaluative way to track and update trends in one's actions such that they are better for the world. In particular, one of the things that happens is you stop pretending that you have to self-sacrifice at all in order to help the world. That's bullshit. It's just bullshit. You don't. Okay? This is one of the most common confusions people get into. Do I sacrifice myself in order to help the world? Oh, it's my duty to because it's the world and I'm just me. That's more of the same bullshit. The other variation is I just want a good life and I'm going to, like, I don't want to take responsibility for all these other people and all the other situations in the world. I'm just going to have a good life on my own. There's also an important level of bullshit there because it means that you're not looking at the way in which there is no difference between you and reality. But that doesn't mean anything about responsibility. Okay? And that's one of the big challenges that we have in terms of talking about real morality, because all of our concepts of morality are based on a method of shattering minds. There's something else possible. And I claim that it's necessary to create a coherent will, coherent intention, and actually heal the world. In the sense of, like, the root of the word heal is the same as the root of the word whole. To heal is to make whole, to keep it from being split. Heal the mind, heal the heart, heal the world, and it's the same thing. Okay. See, Linda says, I think the basis for the concept of mine is that I want to have certainty that this thing be available for me. Like the way I feel if someone eats my cake, I don't think that has to do with my sense of self, but with having my expectation of future cake taken away. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but it goes through a bunch of loops. I could imagine an orientation that is something like an anticipation of future lack and a sense of fear and a need to protect. What's mine doing on top of that? It seems like it's creating loops of anxiety such that even after you've taken care of it, there's now this worry. And the worry might result in strategizing to make sure that you have more cake later anyway, but how do you resolve it? I claim, this doesn't derive from what I've just said, but I think it derives from what you see if you look, is that there is no way to reach a point of satisfaction when you have a sense of self that is in contrast to something. You can't be satisfied because that contrast is made of severing reality. It is made of one of these fractures. You can't have, like the three characteristics in Buddhism are impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and no self. And the claim is that if you, like, insight meditation is about staring at the structure of reality enough to get these. I think there's a lot to say about that. I might actually just make a video on my understanding of how that works and how it relates to all of these things. But there's something about the unsatisfactoriness that is really essential here. As long as you have a sense, like these three interact with each other. When you deny these three, the denial interacts and creates a kind of psychosis. So the way that this there's this confusion around what would it be to actually be satisfied. It turns out you can never be satisfied. It is fundamental to the nature of the you that thinks that I am talking to you. But there can be presence, which the word you, me, whatever, like the sense of self could apply to, that is made of satisfaction. It is made of eternity. It sounds mystical, and I think this is close to what a lot of mystics have been trying to talk about for a long time. But I think it's understandable, and I think a huge amount of what we're going through as a species is the need to evolve an explicit intellectual understanding of this thing that is beyond the intellect. I think it's doable. So, Linda, while I want to agree with you, and I also want to assert that I think mine is adding extra loops that creates more pain. The ability of adding valuing yourselves as superiors. Yes, cool. Marcello says, a church claims to be an attempt to coordinate guilt-based memes, which you call impossible. Why does it fail? Because you cannot create a coherent will by getting away from bad things. Okay? This is one of the basic things that come, like behaviorism basically found two related results, which like this also just falls out of the logic of it if you stare at it. But one is, well, you cannot create long-term change in behavior through punishment. All you can do is cause the behavior to be masked, to be suppressed. But like the difference is that it will reemerge in other cases where the being has some sense that they can sort of get away with it. Okay? Whereas you can change behavior with reward. The basic reason is if you imagine that you want to send people north, and what you do is you punish them every time they move in a direction that is like south. Like they just scatter. They'll on average scatter north. But if you just keep shocking them, saying no, not west, no, not east, no, not northwest, but maybe we'll make that shock lighter, but no, we can't make exceptions. But it'll kind of be kind of vague and confusing. It's very hard unless you create this pain channel that hits all of the options except the one that you want. And it turns out that human minds are brilliant. There's something to say about the relationship between the human mind, which is different from memes. It's a mimetic evolutionary environment. And you can watch it in real time. One of these videos, I want to walk people through the experience of watching how their minds actually work, so you can have wise knowing of that process. And when you hold that up to a wise knowing of how evolution works, something fantastic emerges. You realize how wonderful a tool the mind actually is. It's just that a lot of memes hijack the mind for their own evolutionary purposes. Right? So because the mind is so clever, it comes up with, like, if the challenge is, for instance, avoid the discomfort associated with working on my dissertation. And like, there are lots of ways to avoid the discomfort. One of them is to finish the dissertation. That's true, but it's not the easiest one. This is where a huge amount of procrastination comes from. The same thing applies at the level of a church. The same thing applies at the level of a civilization. You cannot create coherence by saying what not to do and associating what not to do with pain, with fear, with coercion. It doesn't work. What does work is creating a vivid vision. The reason this hasn't evolved yet is because creating a vivid vision creates coherence that threatens mind-shattering mimetic structures. And there's no central intelligence in the mimetic structures themselves that can recognize that fact and do something different. So the kind of church that would be successful would be one that is aligned with the mind-shattering memes, which is why guilt is such a powerful theme in so many Western religions. The Eastern religions do something very similar. They just don't talk about it as much. Guilt is more of a foundational thing in their culture, so it can be implicitly used, but it's unspoken. Right? Guilt and group identity, in broad strokes. And I don't mean to create too wide a paintbrush there. Let's see. So Linda says, I did a PhD in physics. No way along the way did anyone tell me the scientific method. Right. Yep, because it's bullshit. There is no scientific method. There's curiosity and a sincere desire for truth. It turns out that when you point that at domains, and there's something interesting to ask about, how did we decide to carve reality into domains? Do you notice how much that looks like shattering the attentional psyche of our collective academia? Well, that's interesting. There's just curiosity and a sincere desire for truth. That's it. And then there are, within certain contexts, methods that hone that. Let's see, Rupert asks, all beings, all conscious beings? Haha, so what is and is not consciousness? Is a rock conscious? Well, I'm conscious of it. How does that work? I don't want to get into that too much. But I assume what you're talking about is something like the Bodhisattva vow. Like I didn't mention this, but in practice, I'm basically rederiving the immense sanity of a bodhisattva vow when seen from wise knowing. And I also claim that when you see the bodhisattva vow from wise knowing, you will have taken it. That's just how it works. You don't have to ever take it. You don't have to swear anything to anyone. It just becomes obvious. It's sort of like, I now recognize that it is a good idea not to cut my own head off. Like, you don't have to promise that. You just don't do it. Right? So when talking about beings, well, there's this interesting question of, are memes beings? Well, one of the things I'm arguing is that we can think of them as beings, and then we get a bunch of very useful intuitions. So a lot of what I am gesturing towards would include honoring and freeing all the memes as well. Are they conscious? That's difficult to know. Like, what does it mean? What are you talking about? Right? I think that here it's very easy to get lost in mental babble philosophy. But I don't mean to say all philosophy is like that. I mean, there's mental babble philosophy, and that's mostly useless. It's entertaining, and it's mental masturbation. And it's very easy to get into that when talking about, well, what is consciousness? But I think much more practically, there's something of, well, what does that question do for you? What would knowing the answer do for you? Okay? I think that there's something very practical about noticing, I am conscious. How do I know that? That's what knowing is. Beyond that, I have a lot of not knowing. I don't know if any of you are conscious. I assume it, but I don't know what that means. I don't experience from behind your eyes, I experience from behind mine. Whatever that means, whatever mine means, there's a deep uncertainty about all of that, and that's okay. That's what's real, because I'm looking at it. And you can look at it too, whatever you are and whatever it means. I think that's much closer to the reality that I'm wanting to point at than is this question of, well, what is consciousness? Rupert says consciousness is a meme. Yeah, the concept of consciousness is a meme. The thing that consciousness points at, or is trying to point at in some ways, well, what is it? I don't know. I don't think knowing that is a thing that we can really do very well. See, David's asking, are you suggesting that all mimetic evolution occurs along one of only two paths, bullshit path or truthful conscious path? No, but I'm saying that there is a convergent evolutionary tendency in that direction. Sort of like there's a convergent evolutionary tendency towards either self-cloning or sexual propagation. There are more complicated things that happen. Biology is kind of complicated, but there are generally two-ish strategies that are so overwhelmingly successful compared to the alternatives that they show up much more than the others do. But like, for instance, it's unclear which one you would want to say a really good joke propagates on. Is a joke mind-shattering? Well, some people would argue that puns are, but like in a particular way, puns also kind of light up, hey, there's this stupid thing, vacuums suck, blah, ha, ha. Okay, great. So there's this association between vacuums and sucking also means is bad. That's cute. And it sort of highlights in consciousness this association, and there's like, right? Right? So how is that propagating? To the extent that it propagates, how does it propagate? Which path is it? Does it actually do anything for us to specify which one it propagates down? Instead, you can look at the propagation strategy and see, well, what effect does this have on the things that we care about? I think that's more the thing that I want to point at. It just turns out that it is useful to track two major different kinds of mimetic evolution because the smartest memes, the most insidious, clever memes, generally follow one of these two pathways, and almost all of the problems we're running into seem to come from the mind-shattering, disconnect from reality, encourage bullshit type. Let's see. Brandon says, that process all sounds good, but what would bring someone to choose to start this process? You are a very sneaky question asker. In short, I don't know. My hope is to highlight a bunch of things that have been very confusing for people, that most of these mind-shattering memes have not evolved to prevent from being able to be pointed out. Like Oh, look, there's this pervasive sense of there's something wrong with me. Like there's a way in which there are memes that are starting to evolve to highlight this, and we're starting to see some mimetic evolution trying to talk about that, of just believe in yourself and think positive thoughts, and the whole law of attraction stuff about focus on the future that you want and affirm your own positivity, and you were brought to this world in order to create the life that you most enjoy. Like this is responding to some of these recognitions, uh, but it's sort of hopping past the recognition to some extent, and it doesn't get to the depths of it. It doesn't really get to the depths of, oh, I'm choosing to check Facebook because something feels wrong, because I can't stand something about the present moment. Like being able to really notice that and separate that from I'm doing something wrong. Noticing the I'm doing something wrong is more of the same pain. Right? So this is just one example. It seems to me that it is possible to point out some of these things in a way that lights up another option. And I think, it's sort of like waving my hands a little bit, waving my hands a lot. I think that metaphorically speaking, we can think of the universe as implicitly having an intention. I don't mean that the universe thinks like we think, although we are part of the universe and here we are thinking, so it thinks exactly like we think. But but I don't mean to say that there is a being like us that is the universe. I mean more like there's sort of a revealed trend, for instance, in evolution, to create complexity. And that tendency to create complexity suggests and there's a reason for it. It's like it's mechanical, because that kind of complexity competes better against simpler forms in wider varieties of situations and is better at creating variation, and therefore can outcompete the simpler patterns. It's still evolutionary. There's no extra force here, but there's this emergent result, which is a trajectory of evolution. It seems like in some sense there is a kind of intention that is revealed that the universe seems to have. And when we open ourselves up, we see ourselves as being that which has that intention and is manifesting through that which thinks and that which can plan. So it's sort of like the universe awakens through these eyes, through those eyes. And I think that afterwards it's recognized that it always wanted to. You always wanted to wake up. But I don't mean to claim that something like that there's a plan and that this is part of the plan, and that God, the true God, is now injecting insight into you, or that that's where the will comes from. But I think there's a reason for that language. Right? Not the demiurge, but like the true incomprehensible God, which is you in some strange incomprehensible sense, wants it in some weird way. But this is more revealing the nature of how it appears as you go through the process. In truth, I don't know how it works. I just observe that it seems to, in general, and I think it's because truth tends to outcompete bullshit. Okay, let's see. Linda says, the draft seems reasonable to me, but I will have to check how much I am understanding you versus filling in with things I already believe. Strongly endorsed. I have to give up objective morality in order to become an aspiring, effective altruist. Oh, had to give up objective morality. Yep. And I think that effective altruism doesn't go far enough, because it's claiming that implicitly that there is something, you can just replace objective morality with utility functions, approximately. Not everybody does this, but what gives the utility functions a special place? Why do we care? Why don't we swap it with the utility function that says, you know what, actually pain and suffering is the best thing in the universe. Let's maximize that. That's a utility function. there's a question of why that one? What gives that one validation? The one that EAs tend to use, like let's encourage life, let's encourage happiness, let's encourage quality adjusted life years. Why? We can add a bunch of philosophy, but a lot of the philosophy, in my experience, often just adds noise. There's something very deep about the structure of how we experience whatever this weird thing that existence is as. it's tricky, and it requires diving into some things that are classically described as religion, spirituality, or mysticism, I think. Let's see, David asking Linda about that. Linda says, this time lag is annoying. I was looking at what it felt to say, that is mine, and there were no concept of self in there. And there was no concept of self in there. I think that the concept of mine is older than the concept of self. Cool, that might be. My guess is what you're talking about is the sense of grabbing and the cognition that is around that is older than the concept of self. The concept of mine is incoherent without a concept of whose it is. That's not just an intellectual thing. I think that's a direct experiential thing. But the component that ends up getting mapped to mine, I think, can exist before a sense of self. That seems very sensible to me. If the school administrator calls the sciences and the humanities separate subjects, they're implying that you can't do science to people. Yeah. Linda, you can't create long-term change from punishment. This is contradictory to the learned helplessness with the shock collar. So what I meant by that is it's not that you can't create long-term change in behavior. It's that the kind of change that you do can't be in a certain direction. You can't say, let's go here, and now we're going to make that happen. Like by just entirely with shock collars, unless you can constrain all of the options. In practice, when culture wants to move in a certain direction, it tries to. That's the basic thing that happens. When it turns out, oh, that's the evolutionary direction that the mimetics need to move in, they do try to constrain all the other options. Okay. This is part of why a lot of people can have a sense that there is no place in culture for them. Because like all of the options that aren't the official ones have been banned and told that you're wrong and that you shouldn't do that. Gender is a thing that's showing up right now about this. Like everybody is a man and fits this pattern, or is a woman and fits this pattern. And if you don't fit one of those patterns, you're wrong. Like, okay, but what if I don't fit one of those patterns? What do I do then? Again, this is one of the mimetic battles that we're having, one of the aspects of the culture wars. So this is like fencing people in. But the thing that you can't do by creating that kind of structure, you can't build a coherent global culture. Because the coherence, the coordination, requires having an overall view. And you can't have an overall view by saying a whole bunch of no's about all of your options. It's like that's the thing that I'm trying to point at. The reason has to do with this massive, you end up with this multipolar battle. It's the multipolarness that you're trying to solve. You can't solve that by creating more poles. Okay? That's the thing that I'm trying to gesture towards. I hope that clarifies it. It's also possible that there's a slip in my thinking. I think it's interesting that the way that I want to put these metaphors together has what appears to be a contradiction there. So I'll chew on that and I'll take that. I think that it's worthwhile for me to look at that and see if I can extract it a little bit better. Yeah, I don't think that there's a contradiction here. What I'm trying to highlight is there's no coherencing force. You can't get a coherencing force by shattering. Do you think the suffering that we are going through as a society is needed to create the pressure to start finding other ways of handling everything like what you're trying to share? I think emergently, yes, obviously. I don't think that everybody has to go through the suffering, but I think the culture did. I think that there's a dark way where it was actually necessary for us to go through the Holocaust. It's not because I think that there's very much because the Holocaust was horrible. Very, very much because it was horrible. Because there's a way where we needed to sort of be confronted with the fact that we are capable of that degree of horror, and that we were doing it as a result of trying to do good things. Which means that there's something broken about the ways that we're trying to do things. There's an important way where we haven't finished learning those lessons. Okay. There are some mimetic structures that are frighteningly similar to the ones that resulted in Nazism that keep reemerging. Because when we talk about never again, um, people are often grabbing too many of the explicit signs of Nazism in order to say never again. Never again judging a people by their race. Never again the structure of fascism. Right? Never again swastikas. Like, let's not draw swastikas anymore. Never again white supremacy. And I'm not saying that these are wrong things to focus on. I'm not saying that we shouldn't attend to these things. But the problem is that it wasn't, like, none of these pieces were actually the core thing that made Nazism dangerous. It's not the thing that resulted in torturing people. The thing that resulted in systematically torturing and exterminating entire swaths of people in horrendous ways was something deep that we haven't looked at. We really have not looked at yet, and we keep observing those mimetic structures re-emerging. Sometimes under the banner of never again. So there's, I'm hoping that we can actually learn from our suffering. And it seems to me that there's a way in which trauma is the way in which growth happens. Like, you actually traumatize your muscles in order to become stronger. But you traumatize them and then you recover. That's where the impetus for muscle growth comes from. So there's this, I think that there's a need, there's an importance related to learning from our collective traumas and from our collective suffering. And I think that some suffering has been essential so that we can know what we're talking about. We would not have understood the potential for the atheist memeplex to result in evil without the Holocaust. But it wasn't just the atheist memeplex. It was a whole lot of things. It had to do with the structure of trying to reinvent meaning within a materialist frame without recognizing that there is something nihilistic at the core of the materialist frame. That's another component of it that we haven't addressed as a society. Part of it had to do with the idea that the right way to deal with dangerous memes is to destroy the people who carry them. We still have that idea. It is still an essential component. Right? So there's still a bunch of learning to do, and now we have the tools to learn them. I hope we don't have to go through even more suffering. I think we will anyway. I hope it never has to be as bad as it was in World War II. But, for instance, I think the pandemic on net will have been good. The same way the Black Plague in Europe was on net good. Which is not to say anything about it being great for people to get sick and die, but the net effect for the species, I think this might help kick us in a really good direction. Maybe. Okay. I am actually about 20 minutes over from where I had originally planned to end. So I'm going to wrap up here. I want to acknowledge that there's a bunch of stuff that I had hoped to get to in this video that I didn't end up getting to, having to do with addressing the interplay between our own internal shame structures and the way that culture works. There's a bunch of very lived, vivid experiences about why we feel like we should do things and why certain things are necessary, and how this violates the development of a joyous, coherent will, and why developing a joyous, coherent will feels insane when you first try to do it. It doesn't have to, but it often does. There's a lot there that I think is important to touch on. I'd hoped to get into that, and I'm constantly drafting and redrafting these things, so getting there. So I may eventually come back to this, and well, hopefully soon I will come back to that and really dig into it. Okay. So for now, thanks for listening. I see Rupert has one last comment here. Because I want to. Thank you for not wanting to destroy me because I carry a dangerous meme. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, it is my desire for us to move into a world where an idea evolving doesn't mean that we have to destroy the carriers of that evolution, and that an idea evolving becomes a context for us to better understand truth and better ways of caring for each other and for ourselves and for everything that exists. So I think that's the only coherent direction I can see us all moving in. That might just be a limitation of my imagination. We'll see what happens. Let's see. Brandon says, maybe you shouldn't listen to these sneaky comments as much next time. Well, yeah, potentially. If I just have a message, though, I could just post it. I could record a video ahead of time and blast it. I think there's something valuable about being able to have a conversation, too, and being able to, to address things as they arise. But I'll account for that. Okay, everyone. Thank you for watching, and I'll have more for you later. Cheers.